We've got a blitz battle on our hands between the young superstar Nodirbek Abdusattorov and the brilliant Laurel Aronian. White opens, and we are heading into a French defense. Abdusattorov plays e4, and Aronian responds with a solid French defense. White advances with e5, locking the center, and black immediately challenges it with c5, a classic advance variation setup. Both sides develop their pieces routinely. Black's knights find active squares, putting pressure on White's center, and after a brief build-up, White captures on c5, which is immediately recaptured. The maneuvering continues, White repositions, and Aronian's knight on g6 becomes a target. Abdusattorov decides to trade his light-squared bishop for it, but this capture on g6 opens the h-file for Black's rook. And right here, White has a chance to seize a real advantage. Instead of the move played, there was a powerful idea. The stronger move was queen to d3. After queen to e7, rook to e1 keeps the pressure, and if pawn to f6, the queen snaps up the pawn on g6 with check, winning material. But in the game, Abdusattorov plays bishop to g5, and this slip lets the opportunity go, and Aronian finds the perfect reply. Pawn to f6. This is the only move that punishes White's bishop placement, immediately challenging it and setting up a tactic to win a piece. White has little choice but to capture, so pawn takes on f6. Another fantastic move from Aronian. He recaptures with the pawn to f6, keeping the pressure on the bishop. And here's the point. If White plays bishop to e3, Black simply takes the bishop. After pawn recaptures, queen to b6 attacks multiple weaknesses and wins a pawn. White is forced to retreat the bishop to f4, and Aronian immediately strikes in the center with the pawn to e5. And here, bishop to g3 is another slip. The engine preferred rook to e1 to challenge Black's central control. This move allows Aronian to consolidate his advantage and build even more pressure. Black develops beautifully with bishop to e6 and queen to d7 controlling the center. White tries to create some counterplay on the queen side, but Black feels comfortable enough to expand on the king side too. The action heats up on the queen side as White pushes the b-pawn. After a series of captures, Aronian decides to trade rooks, snapping off the rook on a1. Recapturing with the queen to a1 is natural, but it's an inaccuracy. A much more complex line starting with pawn takes knight on c6 was stronger. Now Black's advantage is very solid. Aronian calmly improves his position, bringing the knight to e7. White tries to complicate with knight takes e5, but this is another error. It looks active, but it walks into a powerful sequence that will ultimately lead to Black winning a rook. And again, Aronian is razor sharp. Pawn takes the knight on e5, the only move, and a brilliant one. Here's the deep idea. If White recaptures with bishop takes e5, Black can now castle kingside. Then bishop to d4 puts immense pressure, and after the bishops are traded, Black wins the rook. White pushes forward with c4 and tries a desperate queen check on a8, but Black calmly blocks with the queen to c8, neutralizing the threat. White is in a tough spot, but there was a chance to bail out into a difficult endgame. The best try was to force a queen trade. Queen takes queen on c8, check. After bishop recaptures, bishop takes the pawn on e5, and following the trade of bishops, White's rook takes on e5, winning a pawn and simplifying. But that's not what happened. Instead, queen to a3 keeps the queens on the board, and this allows Black's attack to rage on. Aronian plays knight to g6. This is a small slip, as queen to c5 was even stronger, but make no mistake, Black is still completely winning here. The central pawns come off the board, and Black's pieces are perfectly coordinated. The king steps up to f7 for safety, and White's pieces are stuck on defensive duties. White is trying to hold on, but this next move is a mistake. There was a more resilient defense. Queen to d3 was the way. After rook to d8, queen to b1 keeps things together. And after the bishop takes the knight on e3, pawn recaptures, and White is still fighting. But in the game, rook to d1 is played, and this simply allows Black to win a free pawn. And Aronian doesn't hesitate, snapping up the pawn on b5 with the queen. White plays rook to c1, but this is another inaccuracy. It just invites Black's rook into the game with devastating effect. Just as predicted, Black's rook swings over to c8, piling on the pressure. White shuffles the rook over to e1 in defense. Aronian is completely dominant, but even here, there was a more crushing continuation. Instead of the move he chose, rook to c5 was the killer. After rook to d1, the rook invades to c3. Queen to a8 is met by queen to c6, and White's position crumbles. Back in the game, though, Black plays queen to c5, which is still overwhelmingly winning. White's queen tries to get active on a4, but Black's b-pawn simply pushes it back, forcing the queen to retreat to d1. Aronian decides to simplify, trading his powerful bishop for the knight on e3, and recapturing with the pawn to e3 is an error. This capture further opens up White's king, creating even more targets for Black's attack. Black's passed b-pawn starts rolling. White creates some kingside threats with the h-pawn and queen, forcing Aronian's king to step to g7. White plays queen to g5, but this is a mistake. The better defensive try was to capture the pawn on h3. Now Black's attack is about to become decisive. Aronian brings his final piece into the attack, rook to f8, preparing to use the open file. This is a critical moment, and White makes a major error. The position was difficult, but there was a better defense. The key was pawn takes h3. Even after rook to f5, White could defend with queen to d8, and after pawn to b3, pawn to h4 would win a pawn and keep the game going. But in the game, rook to a1 is played, and this walks right into a killer tactic. And there it is. Rook to f5, a brilliant move setting up a winning attack. And this is the final blunder of the game. White had one last chance to defend, though it was already very difficult. The only try was queen to g4, after queen takes e3 check, king to h2. And if pawn takes g2, the king can recapture, and White is still alive. But instead, queen to d8 is played, and this loses on the spot to a beautiful combination. The winning shot! Aronian plays queen takes pawn on e3 with check. This is the start of a forced sequence that will win a full rook and end the game. The king is forced to h2, but there is no escape. Black's follow-up is absolutely crushing, and the final nail in the coffin, pawn takes pawn on g2. This simple pawn capture is devastating. The unstoppable threat is now queen to f3 check, followed by rook to h5. The position has completely collapsed, and at this point Abdusattorov resigns. Laurel Aronian takes the win. White saw that the position was completely hopeless, resigning because of this devastating continuation. Queen to c7 check, the rook blocks on f7, but then bishop takes the pawn on e5 with check. Knight recaptures, and queen takes the rook on f7 with check, and it's all over.